The day Hollis Mercer came home early, he did not walk into a quiet family house. He walked into the first crack in a nightmare that had been growing inside his own home while he was too busy, too trusting, and too blind to see it. By the time that day was over, he would understand that his 4-year-old daughter had not been refusing school because she was spoiled, shy, or sickly. She had been refusing it because something far worse was already happening to her long before any classroom ever entered the picture. That morning had started under a gray Connecticut sky that made everything outside the Mercer estate look drained of warmth. The house itself stood polished and impressive, the kind of place that looked perfect from the street, with tall windows, stone steps, trimmed hedges, and the silent confidence of old money. Inside, though, the air felt oddly cold. Not from weather, but from routine. From control. From the kind of order that leaves no room for noise, mess, appetite, or childhood. Hollis stood in his dressing room adjusting his tie with the distracted precision of a man who had trained himself to function without rest. He had spent years building companies, attending meetings, closing deals, and convincing himself that providing financially was the same as being present. Since the death of his first wife, he had learned to survive by keeping his calendar full and his emotions compartmentalized. Grief had not disappeared. It had simply been organized into a part of his life he rarely opened. The house was large enough to hide silence in every hallway, and Hollis had grown used to mistaking silence for peace. When he came downstairs, he found Blythe already in the kitchen, immaculate as always, her hair pinned perfectly, her posture straight, her expression bright in that polished, reassuring way that made everything around her seem under control. She looked like the answer to a broken household. She had entered his life when everything felt unstable, and Hollis had clung to that steadiness without asking too many questions. He had wanted to believe that a woman so disciplined, so composed, so knowledgeable about health and structure, was exactly what his daughter needed. At the breakfast counter sat little Eloan, tiny in an oversized chair, her legs hanging, her hands locked together in her lap. She looked so small that morning that the expensive kitchen around her only made her seem smaller. Her cream-colored pajamas hung loosely on her frame. Her shoulders were drawn inward. Her eyes stayed lowered, as if even looking up might be a mistake. Nothing about her matched the lively, curious child Hollis sometimes remembered from earlier days, before the rules became stricter, before Blythe began explaining every weakness, every pale morning, every stomachache as part of a larger health issue only she seemed qualified to manage. Blythe set down one of her usual drinks in front of the child, a thick green mixture she insisted was essential to Eloan's recovery, her cleansing, her immunity, her digestion, her balance. There was always a reason, always a theory, always a controlled explanation that sounded polished enough to silence doubt. Hollis had heard so many of them that he no longer examined them closely. He had accepted the idea that Eloan was fragile. He had accepted the idea that school overwhelmed her body. He had accepted the idea that strict routines, special liquids, limited foods, and carefully monitored activity were all necessary. He had accepted all of it because the alternative was admitting that he did not fully know what was happening to his own child. Eloan lifted the glass with both hands and swallowed the drink the way a child swallows medicine she has already learned not to resist. Her face tightened almost imperceptibly. Her small body flinched once, then went still again. Hollis noticed that, but only as one notices something unsettling while already halfway focused on the next obligation. He asked about school, about how she felt, about whether she was ready to go. The answer came the way it had come too many times before. She was tired. Her stomach hurt. She did not want to go. To Hollis, it sounded like the same sad pattern. To Blythe, it was proof that Eloan needed more protection, more supervision, more intervention at home. She framed everything gently, rationally, expertly. She made concern sound like science. She made restriction sound like care. And Hollis, exhausted and rushed, let himself be guided once again toward the easiest conclusion, that his daughter needed her stepmother's help more than she needed his questions. There was only one person in the room who seemed unable to hide her disgust. Miss Darlene, the longtime housekeeper, moved stiffly through breakfast cleanup with an expression she tried and failed to contain. A plate clattered harder than it should have. A muttered word fell under her breath. The tension flickered for a second, sharp and real, before Blythe smoothed it over with a dismissive smile and a quick excuse about old age, bad nerves, and clumsiness. Hollis frowned, but even then his irritation went in the wrong direction. He read the discomfort in the room as household friction. He did not yet understand that he was standing in the middle of a silent battle and misidentifying the only person who was actually horrified. As he prepared to leave, Eloane slipped off her chair and padded across the floor toward him. She was holding something behind her back. When she reached him, she offered a folded drawing, wrinkled and gray with heavy crayon lines. Hollis opened it casually, expecting something childish and sweet. Instead, he found an image that snagged in his mind with surprising force. The drawing showed a crooked house with blacked-out windows, sealed and shut. In front of it sat a small figure with its knees pulled to its chest. The figure had no mouth. He stared at it longer than he meant to. The image carried a weight no child should know how to draw. It was not random scribbling. It was not cheerful nonsense. It felt trapped, muted, airless. The kind of picture that does not explain itself but still leaves a mark. He looked down at Eloane and reached to touch her forehead. The instant his hand met her skin, a chill moved through him. She was cold and damp at the same time, with sweat beading at her temples and a strange weakness in her stillness. Blythe responded immediately, smoothly, as if she had already prepared for that exact concern. She explained it away as part of the body's cleansing response, part of detox, part of release, part of healing. She always had language ready. And because Hollis had a car waiting, a trip scheduled, and a mind already splitting itself between home and business, he let the explanation stand. He kissed the air near his daughter's head, tucked the drawing into his hand, and walked out the front door with unease pressing softly at the back of his thoughts. Outside, the cold struck harder than expected. Hollis stepped into the back seat of his black sedan, and as the gates of the estate opened and the car pulled away, he looked again at the drawing. This time he noticed details he had missed. The windows were not simply dark. They looked sealed. The small figure was not sitting comfortably. It looked cornered. The missing mouth bothered him most of all. A child can draw fear without understanding how clearly she is confessing it, and for the first time that morning, Hollis felt something sharper than concern. He felt the edge of guilt. The farther the car moved from the estate, the more the image of Eloane stayed with him. Not just the drawing, but her thin wrists, her downcast eyes, the way she drank that green mixture without protest, the way Miss Darlene's face had tightened in the background. He began assembling explanations in his mind, but each one felt less solid than the last. He told himself perhaps Eloane had become overly sensitive. Perhaps she was struggling with grief in ways no one had fully understood. Perhaps Miss Darlene had been filling her head with inappropriate fears. Perhaps the strict routines at home were unpleasant but necessary. Perhaps all of this still added up to care. But doubt, once it finds an opening, does not leave quietly. Then the weather changed. The radio cut through the silence of the car with an urgent update. A sudden winter system had rolled in faster than expected. Flights were being cancelled. Roads were worsening. Travel plans were collapsing across the region. Hollis listened, rubbed his temple, and felt the day shift under him. The business trip that had seemed unavoidable only an hour earlier was now impossible. The meeting would not happen. The airport was shutting down. There was nowhere to go but back. The driver asked what he wanted to do. Hollis looked down once more at the drawing in his lap, at the little figure without a mouth, at the blacked-out windows, at the shape of a child who looked less like a daughter living in comfort and more like a prisoner trying to describe a cage. Something in him tightened. He gave the order to turn the car around. On the way back, he stopped at an expensive toy boutique and bought a porcelain doll, beautifully dressed and boxed with a red ribbon, the kind of gift a guilty father buys when he wants to repair a feeling he cannot yet name. He told himself he was making up for being gone so often. He told himself the doll would brighten Eloan's face. He told himself that returning early with a surprise might soften whatever heaviness had hung over breakfast. But under that effort was another reason, darker and harder to admit. He wanted to see the house again without warning. He wanted to catch the rhythm of it when no one expected him back. He wanted, without fully admitting it to himself, to test the truth of the world he had been accepting so easily. By the time the car rolled back through the gates, sleet had begun collecting on the hedges and window ledges. The Mercer house stood silent under the white-gray sky, too still, too dim, too sealed. Hollis told the driver not to sound the horn. He picked up the doll himself and walked to the door alone. He planned to enter quietly, maybe go upstairs, maybe change clothes, maybe surprise them gently. That was what he told himself as he unlocked the front door and stepped into the dark foyer. But the silence that met him did not feel restful. It felt contained. There was no television murmuring in the background. No childish music. No footsteps. No household movement. The air inside seemed to be holding its breath. Hollis set the gift aside, removed his coat, and stood still for a moment, listening. The house that had always seemed expensive and orderly now felt strangely watchful, as if something inside it had frozen in place. He started up the stairs, his steps swallowed by thick carpet, his own home suddenly making him feel like an intruder. Halfway down the upstairs corridor, he stopped. A steady sound was ticking somewhere ahead. Sharp. Measured. Mechanical. Not a clock from downstairs, not plumbing, not weather against glass. It came in strict intervals, each beat falling with a cold precision that made the silence around it feel even worse. Hollis listened harder. The sound was coming from the family room at the far end of the hall, the room Blythe always referred to as a calm space, a place for quiet activities, restorative routines, and supervised exercises. He moved toward it slowly. Then he heard Blythe's voice. Not the warm, polished voice from breakfast. Not the soothing voice she used when explaining health plans and delicate digestion. This voice was lower, flatter, harder. Controlled in a different way. It carried no affection. Only command. Hollis went still beside the wall, every nerve suddenly alert. And in the second before he looked through that narrow opening and saw what had really been happening to his daughter, he already knew one thing with terrifying certainty. Whatever lived behind that door was the true reason Eloan had stopped wanting to leave her bed, her room, and her house. And once he saw it, nothing in that family would ever be the same again. Hollis Mercer did not push the door open right away. He stood in the dim hallway with one hand braced against the wall, listening as the sound inside the family room settled into a pattern that now felt unbearable. The ticking he had heard from a distance was a metronome, slow and exact, beating like a mechanical heart in a room where no warmth seemed to exist. Between those steady clicks came Blythe's voice, stripped of every trace of tenderness, and beneath it came another sound that hit Hollis harder than any scream could have. It was the strained breathing of a child trying not to collapse. For one suspended moment he remained frozen, caught between disbelief and recognition. Part of him still wanted to be wrong. Part of him still searched for some harmless explanation, some controlled activity taken out of context, some disciplined routine that only sounded cruel because he was listening through fear. But then Eloan's breathing broke again, thin and ragged, and the illusion he had been living inside began to tear from top to bottom. He moved closer and looked through the narrow crack. The room beyond had once been decorated to soothe. Soft pastel walls, shelves of carefully arranged toys, light curtains, plush chairs, framed watercolor animals, all the details chosen to create the image of a safe place for a little girl. Yet in the center of that room, every soft thing had become a lie. Eloan stood on a small rounded wooden stool that forced her body to keep correcting itself to stay upright. She was balancing on one foot, her other leg bent, both arms raised straight above her head. Resting in those tiny shaking hands was a thick hardback dictionary far too heavy for a child her age to hold. Her body was trembling so violently that Hollis could see it from the doorway. Sweat had soaked the neckline of her pale dress. Her thin arms quivered under the weight. Her supporting knee kept dipping and locking again in desperate little spasms as her body fought not to give out. Her lips were dry. Her face had gone beyond ordinary exhaustion into something more frightening, a drained, ghostly stillness that belonged to deprivation, not discipline. On the wall in front of her was a small dark dot, and her eyes were fixed on it with the terrible concentration of a child who has learned that even blinking can be dangerous. A few feet away, Blythe sat comfortably on a cream-colored sofa with one leg crossed over the other, elegant as ever, one hand wrapped around a teacup and the other holding a stopwatch. The metronome ticked beside her. She was calm, composed, almost serene, as if she were not presiding over the slow collapse of a 4-year-old girl but conducting a minor household lesson. That calmness was what made the scene monstrous. There was no visible rage, no wild cruelty, no dramatic violence. Just order. Precision. A polished woman measuring the suffering of a child as though pain were a useful ingredient in some superior method. Hollis felt his heartbeat slam so hard against his ribs that it seemed impossible Blythe could not hear it. In one sweep of vision, every odd detail from the past months rearranged itself into truth. The cold forehead, the trembling hands, the endless fatigue, the refusal to go to school. The fear in Eloan's eyes at breakfast, the green drinks, the stomachaches, the silence. None of it had been mysterious fragility. None of it had been a delicate constitution. It was this. It had always been this. What shattered him most was how practiced Eloan looked. This was not a child caught in a single bad afternoon. This was a child who knew exactly where to place her feet, exactly how to lift her arms, exactly how to stare at that mark on the wall, exactly how to swallow discomfort without protest until her body nearly stopped cooperating. That kind of obedience does not appear overnight. It is carved in by repetition, by fear, by training, by punishment so consistent that resistance begins to feel impossible. The metronome clicked on. Eloan's arms sagged for half a second, and Blythe's posture changed slightly, not with concern, but with alert correction. The stopwatch remained steady in her hand. The atmosphere in the room tightened further. Eloan tried to straighten again, using the last of her strength to lift the book higher, but her body betrayed her. Her shoulders shook. A small sound slipped from her, not loud enough to be a cry, only the involuntary sound of a body nearing failure. That sound tore through Hollis more completely than any dramatic outburst could have done. In that instant he understood another terrible thing. Blythe had not merely been controlling Eloan's body. She had colonized her mind. She had turned endurance into duty, hunger into discipline, pain into virtue, weakness into shame. She had taught a little girl to accept abuse as self-improvement and to fear failure more than suffering. That was why Eloan looked so terrified every morning. That was why she had gone quiet. That was why even her drawing had no mouth. Something violent broke loose inside Hollis. He no longer cared how much noise he made or what explanation might follow. The last scraps of hesitation vanished. He shoved the door open with enough force to slam it against the wall, and the crack of wood and metal cut through the room like a gunshot. The metronome kept ticking for one absurd second before the whole scene shattered. Eloan startled so hard that her balance gave out immediately. The raised leg came down wrong. The stool rolled beneath her. The dictionary fell from her hands and hit the floor with a thick, dead weight just as her small body collapsed beside it. The sound of her falling was not loud, but Hollis felt it like a blow to his own bones. He crossed the room in 2 strides and dropped to his knees beside her, his breath gone, his hands reaching instinctively toward her. But Eloan did not react the way an injured child should react to the sight of her father. She recoiled. Instead of throwing herself toward safety, she scrambled backward on the floor with blind panic, as if his sudden presence had not brought rescue but disaster. Her face twisted in terror. Her breath came in broken bursts. Her hands shook so badly they could barely support her. She looked less afraid of falling than of what would happen because she had fallen. The expression in her eyes was not the fear of pain. It was the fear of disappointing an authority she had been taught could withdraw love at any moment. That was the second knife. Hollis had already seen his daughter suffering. Now he had to see that she had been taught to associate him with judgment. She was frightened not only of Blythe's punishments, but of failing in front of him. Somewhere inside this warped routine, his name, his approval, his expectations had been used as weapons. His absence had become part of the machinery that kept this system running. Blythe had built her control out of her own obsession, but she had anchored it in Hollis's authority. Without realizing it, he had become the silent giant in the room every time Eloan was told to hold still, eat less, endure more, and become worthy. Before he could gather her into his arms, another figure rushed in. Miss Darlene appeared in the doorway breathless, having heard the crash. One look at the room told her what had happened. Her face hardened, not with surprise, but with the grim certainty of someone whose worst fear had just been confirmed in front of the one person who had refused to see it. She crossed to Eloan without hesitation and knelt protectively between the child and the rest of the room, wrapping her arms around the trembling little body with the practiced instinct of someone who had done what little secret comforting she could for far too long. From the deep pocket of her apron she pulled out a napkin-wrapped piece of bread and slipped it into Eloan's hands. Eloan seized it instantly. There was no politeness, no hesitation, no childish pickiness. She ate with desperate concentration, tiny shoulders still shaking, crumbs falling down the front of her dress. The sight was almost unbearable. Hollis stared in disbelief as his daughter, the sole heir to everything he had spent his life building, devoured plain bread like a starving child hiding from punishment. Every expensive object in the room became obscene in that moment. The velvet furniture, the polished floors, the carefully chosen decor, the expensive health products, the curated perfection of the house, all of it collapsed into meaninglessness beside the image of a little girl clinging to bread as if it were contraband. Miss Darlene finally turned toward Hollis, and the restraint she had maintained for months was gone. There was no more careful deference, no more housekeeper's silence, no more fear of losing her job. Her eyes burned with grief and fury. The truth came out not as a revelation but as a flood held back too long. She made it plain that Blythe had been subjecting Eloan to these ordeals for hours at a time whenever Hollis was away. Meals had been withheld. Water restricted. Food secretly offered by Darlene had been taken and thrown away. Every act of comfort had been treated as sabotage. Every ordinary need had been reframed as weakness. And over all of it Blythe had draped the language of refinement, discipline, and health until cruelty had been dressed up as care. Hollis rose slowly to his feet. Across the room, Blythe had finally stood as well. Yet even now she did not look shattered or ashamed. She looked inconvenienced. Exposed, yes, but not remorseful. Her expression remained unervingly controlled, as though she still believed she could regain command of the narrative if she stayed calm enough, rational enough, superior enough. That self-possession chilled Hollis more than panic would have. It meant she did not see herself as monstrous. She saw herself as right. He did not speak to her immediately. He could not trust his voice. Every nerve in his body was vibrating with the effort of not exploding. He bent instead and lifted Eloan from the floor. The shock of her weight nearly undid him. She was far too light. Her little body, still trembling, folded into him with the fragility of something unfinished, something that had been worn down past its natural limit. He could feel the sharpness of her ribs through the fabric. He could feel the unnatural chill in her skin. He could feel how tightly she still clutched the half-eaten bread, as if even now some part of her expected it to be taken away. She did not fully relax into his arms, not yet, but she no longer tried to escape. She looked dazed, emptied, exhausted beyond crying. Hollis turned and carried her downstairs. Each step felt like crossing out the old version of his life. The grand staircase, once just another architectural feature in a successful man's beautiful home, became a dividing line between illusion and knowledge. Below them waited the living room, warmer and brighter than the upstairs chamber of discipline. Miss Darlene ran ahead to fetch a blanket. Hollis settled Eloan on the couch near the fireplace, wrapped her in soft wool, and watched her shiver beneath it. Her hands remained tight around the bread until sleepiness and exhaustion began to loosen her grip. Even there, under warmth, she seemed unable to believe comfort would last. Then Hollis turned back toward the stairs. He stood there like a barrier made of anger and shame. At the top of the staircase, Blythe appeared with the same measured elegance she wore everywhere, descending in silence, composed, almost regal. The image would have been impressive in any other context. Here, it was grotesque. She moved like a woman entering a disagreement, not like someone emerging from the scene of a child's torture. Lavender perfume drifted into the room before she finished her descent, and the scent now made Hollis sick. When she reached the sitting area, the room seemed to narrow around all four of them. Eloan under the blanket. Miss Darlene at her side. Hollis standing between them and Blythe. Fire cracking in the hearth. Snow and sleet hissing faintly against the windows. Every sound sharpened. Every breath mattered. Blythe took a seat as though she still had equal standing in the house, as though this were a discussion to be managed rather than a horror already witnessed. That final display of composure told Hollis what he was truly facing. Not a woman who had snapped once. Not a frightened caretaker who had made harsh mistakes. But a mind so twisted by obsession that it could remain calm after being caught. And Hollis finally understood that the nightmare in his home had never depended on darkness, secrecy, or chaos. It had depended on certainty. Blythe had been certain she was entitled to reshape a child. Certain she knew better than anyone else. Certain that beauty, control, and endurance mattered more than hunger, laughter, school, or play. Certain that Hollis would keep missing what was in front of him because she had wrapped every wound in the language of improvement. That certainty was about to meet something stronger. Because for the first time since Catherine's death, Hollis Mercer was no longer moving through his own life half awake. He was fully present now, fully horrified, and fully unable to look away. The woman in front of him had not merely harmed his daughter. She had turned his home into a private cage and trained his child to live inside it silently. And in the heavy stillness of that room, with Eloan shaking under a blanket and the metronome's ghost still echoing in his head, Hollis knew the next moments would decide everything. Either Blythe would lose her hold forever, or she would try one last time to twist cruelty into reason. What came out of her mouth next would show him how deep the madness truly went. What followed in the living room was not a scene of panic, apology, or collapse. It was something far more disturbing. Blythe did not look like a woman caught doing something evil. She looked like a woman irritated that her work had been interrupted before the results could be appreciated. That composure changed the entire temperature of the room. Hollis had already seen enough to know his daughter had been abused, but as he faced Blythe across the firelit space, he began to understand that the danger inside his home was deeper than cruelty. It was conviction. Blythe believed in what she was doing, and belief made her far more dangerous than rage ever could. Eloan sat curled under the blanket on the sofa, still trembling in small, involuntary waves. The fire warmed the room, but the warmth could not yet reach wherever fear had rooted itself inside her. Miss Darlene remained close, one hand lightly pressed against the child's back, steady and protective, as if she understood that even a passing movement in Blythe's direction might set off another surge of panic. Hollis stood in front of them like a barrier, and for the first time in years he looked less like a polished executive and more like a man stripped down to one raw purpose. Every layer of distraction had burned away. All that remained was a father and the terrible knowledge that he had arrived late. Blythe settled into the armchair opposite the sofa with a posture so elegant it would have been graceful if it were not grotesque in context. The crease of her trousers was still sharp. Her hands were still calm. Her breathing was steady. Even the soft scent of lavender clinging to her seemed obscene now, as if she had perfumed not just herself but the entire machinery of torment she had built upstairs. The contrast between Eloan's shattered little body and Blythe's immaculate composure was so extreme that Hollis felt his own skin tighten with revulsion. He demanded an explanation, and Blythe gave him exactly what she had always given: a theory, a framework, a polished architecture of control dressed up as care. Nothing in her expression suggested remorse. Nothing in her manner suggested uncertainty. She treated the whole thing not as an exposed crime but as a disagreement between the informed and the emotional. That was the moment Hollis truly saw her. She had not been hiding behind lies alone. She had built a worldview strong enough to protect her from guilt. In that worldview, Eloan's suffering was not suffering. It was refinement. Hunger was not deprivation. It was discipline. Exhaustion was not damage. It was progress. Childhood itself, with all its noise and appetite and softness, was the flaw she believed she had been correcting. As Blythe laid out her thinking, Hollis felt a second form of horror creeping over the first. He had expected excuses, maybe tears, maybe desperate minimization. Instead he was met with certainty so cold and organized that it almost carried the rhythm of doctrine. She framed Eloan's pain as necessary shaping. She treated resistance as proof of weakness. She spoke of posture, stamina, control, future, image, standards, all the polished words people use when they want to turn a living person into a project. In her mind, Eloan was not a little girl who needed safety. She was unfinished material. Something soft to be hardened. Something ordinary to be elevated. Something vulnerable to be redesigned before the world had a chance to reject it. Hollis listened, and while the fire cracked beside him, memories began rising with brutal clarity. He remembered every rushed breakfast where Blythe had explained away Eloan's pale face. He remembered the green drinks, the special plans, the carefully measured portions, the insistence that school was too stressful for her body. He remembered signing off on home routines he barely investigated because he was grateful someone else appeared to be handling the details. He remembered the relief he had felt each time Blythe took charge, and that relief now curdled into disgust. He had mistaken domination for competence. He had mistaken severity for structure. He had mistaken a controlled woman for a safe one. And because he had been so willing to be reassured, Blythe had been able to tighten the cage day by day without his interference. There are moments in a person's life when guilt stops being abstract and becomes physical. Hollis felt one of those moments then. It settled into his chest with the weight of a stone. Every time Eloan had reached for him with tired eyes and he had accepted Blythe's explanation, he had handed his daughter back to her tormentor. Every time he left for another trip believing his household was stable, he had left Eloan alone inside a system designed to break her obedience into permanent shape. He was not the architect of the nightmare, but he had funded it, housed it, and failed to interrupt it. That realization did not weaken his anger. It sharpened it. Eloan shifted under the blanket and took another tiny bite of the bread Miss Darlene had given her. She ate slowly now, no longer with frantic hunger but with the caution of someone who expected any comfort to be temporary. Even that small movement became part of the conflict unfolding in the room. Blythe's eyes found the bread almost immediately. There was something in her face then that exposed more than her words had. Not compassion. Not concern. Calculation. A reflexive, disapproving awareness, as if the child's access to food were not a relief but a setback. Hollis saw it, and once he saw it, he could not unsee the depth of her obsession. Even now, after being confronted, she was still tracking intake, still reading Eloan not as a frightened child but as a body to be regulated. That single glance turned the room colder. Miss Darlene saw it too. Her jaw hardened. She had lived in this house long enough to memorize the rhythms of Blythe's control, and now that the truth was out in the open, there was no reason left to swallow what she knew. She began revealing the pattern in full. Not one brutal scene, not one difficult afternoon, but a system. Exercises timed down to the minute. Food restrictions disguised as wellness. Punishments disguised as corrective methods. Long periods of silence imposed on Eloan whenever she cried, asked for snacks, slouched, moved too much, or failed to meet the standard Blythe had invented for her. There had been secret attempts to help, small rebellions carried out in kitchens and laundry rooms, bits of soup, crackers, bread, comfort offered in stolen seconds. And each time Blythe had found out, she had retaliated by tightening the rules again. The story of the house, once hidden behind polished surfaces, was finally being told in plain terms. Hollis could feel each new detail adding weight to the air. Blythe had not simply starved the body. She had trained the mind. She had made Eloan believe that appetite was shameful, rest was failure, and being loved depended on self-denial. That was why the child had withdrawn from school. A classroom meant witnesses. Other children meant comparison. Snacks, games, movement, noise, ordinary joy, all of it clashed with the rigid inner prison Blythe had built inside her. School was not the problem. Exposure was. Hollis turned back toward Eloan, and what he saw nearly undid him again. The little girl had gone very still, listening with her huge eyes lowered, as if every adult word in the room might reshape her fate. She did not look confused by what Darlene was describing. She looked ashamed. That shame was the ugliest evidence of all. Children who know they are being hurt often still believe they deserve it. Blythe had managed to push the blame so deeply into Eloan's small heart that the child was carrying the burden of her own abuse as if it were her fault. At that point Hollis understood that the house itself had become contaminated. Every staircase, every room, every routine had absorbed Blythe's logic. Even if he removed Eloan from immediate danger, the psychological machinery would keep running inside her unless he destroyed its source completely. This was no longer about a furious argument or a warning or setting better boundaries. It was about severance. Total, immediate, irreversible. Blythe, however, still believed the room could be won. She shifted strategies the way a skilled manipulator always does when one mask fails. First had come rational superiority. Then came personal sacrifice. She recast herself as the one who had given up freedom, time, and ambition to shape Eloan into someone exceptional. She implied that Hollis, with all his money and endless travel, had no standing to judge methods he had never taken the time to understand. It was a calculated move, and under other circumstances it might have landed. Hollis was, after all, vulnerable to the accusation. He had been absent. He had delegated too much. He had let other hands guide his daughter's daily life. Blythe pressed exactly where his guilt was rawest, hoping guilt would weaken his clarity. But the problem for her was simple now. Hollis had seen the stool. He had seen the dictionary. He had seen his daughter collapse. He had seen terror where trust should have been. Some truths cannot be argued away once the body has witnessed them. And still Blythe continued, exposing more of herself with every attempt to justify the unjustifiable. She spoke of toughness as if tenderness were decay. She spoke of beauty as if it were moral worth. She spoke of discipline as if a child's body existed to be shaped into family prestige. She even reached back toward Catherine, the dead woman whose absence still haunted the house, twisting memory into weaponry. In Blythe's mind, Catherine's death had become proof that softness was fatal, that frailty invited ruin, that a Lowen must be forged against all weakness before life could destroy her. It was madness wrapped in logic, grief repurposed into ideology, trauma passed down not through confession but through control. That was when something else clicked in Hollis's mind. This had never been just about Elowen. Blythe was reenacting something. No one becomes this cold, this perfection-driven, this addicted to control without a wound somewhere underneath. Hollis did not know the full shape of that wound yet, but he could sense it. The way she talked about flaw, discipline, image, and worth did not sound invented. It sounded inherited. She was not improvising cruelty. She was replicating a script she knew by heart. And because she believed suffering had once been the price of becoming acceptable, she now expected Elowen to pay it too. The insight did not soften him. It only made the danger clearer. A person acting out ordinary anger can be stopped by shame. A person acting out a sacred belief cannot. Blythe did not feel monstrous because she had built her identity around the belief that harshness was love in its highest form. That meant she would keep going for as long as anyone let her remain near the child. Then came the moment that ended any last illusion of salvage. Blythe rose from her chair with that same eerie calm and moved toward the sofa. She did not lunge. She did not shout. She simply extended herself back into the role of authority, reaching for Elowen with the quiet entitlement of someone convinced that the child still belonged under her command. Elowen's reaction was immediate. The little girl shrank so hard into the corner of the couch that her whole frame seemed to fold inward. Her hands clamped around the bread. Her eyes widened with a terror beyond language. She was not bracing for a debate. She was bracing for possession. Hollis stepped between them before Blythe could get any closer. The movement was fast, instinctive, final. He did not strike her. He did not need to. The force of his refusal landed with more impact than violence could have carried. His arm blocked her path. His body cut off her line of sight to Elowen. The room itself seemed to recoil at the clarity of that gesture. For the first time since this began, Blythe's composure slipped. Not much. Just enough. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a flash of insulted disbelief. She had expected anger, perhaps, but not rejection so absolute. She had expected to defend her methods, not be cast physically out of reach from the child she had treated like property. That was the real beginning of her fall. Hollis's voice, when it came, no longer carried confusion or debate. It carried judgment. He ordered her away from Elowen with a severity that flattened the room. There was no appeal left in it. No husband es hesitation. No room for negotiation. Blythe finally had to see what she had not understood until then. The man she had manipulated through fatigue and trust was gone. In his place stood a father who had crossed the line from doubt into knowledge, and knowledge is the one thing manipulation cannot survive. Miss Darlene tightened the blanket around Aloan as if sealing that truth in place. He looked at Aloan, at the faint tremor still running through her shoulders, at the crust of exhaustion around her eyes, at the way she kept checking his face as if trying to determine whether safety was real or temporary. That look decided everything that still remained to be decided. He crossed to the phone and began issuing orders. The driver was told to bring the car around immediately. The nearest children's hospital was contacted. Security was to remain alert. No one was to let Blythe near the child again. The house, with all its money and cold elegance and poisonous routines, was no longer home. It was simply the location of the crime. Blythe sensed the momentum turning fully against her then. Her composure started to strain under the pressure of consequences becoming real. What had been a battle of narrative was about to become something harder, something she could not regulate with tone or posture. Doctors would see Aloan. Tests would be run. The body would speak. Professionals would put language to what Hollis had only just discovered. Evidence would replace argument. And once that happened, the house of explanations Blythe had lived inside would begin to collapse. Hollis lifted Aloan again, more carefully this time, supporting her head against his shoulder. She felt lighter than anything with a heartbeat should feel. Miss Darlene gathered the blanket around her and moved beside them toward the foyer. Behind them, Blythe remained standing in the living room, no longer regal, no longer victorious, but not yet broken either. She looked like someone trying desperately to calculate which version of herself might still survive what was coming. But Hollis was already beyond that. The sleet caught in Hollis's hair and on the blanket wrapped around his daughter, but he barely felt it. His entire body had narrowed into urgency. As the car doors opened and the child was placed inside, Hollis glanced once back at the mansion. From the outside, it still looked stately, expensive, enviable. From the inside, he now knew, it had been a private training ground for fear. And as the car pulled away through the winter gray toward the hospital lights ahead, Hollis understood that saving Aloan would not end with removing her from Blythe's hands. The body could be fed. The weakness could be treated. But the deeper battle was only beginning. Somewhere inside that tiny, trembling child, Blythe's rules were still alive. The fear of food. The fear of failure. The fear that love had to be earned through pain. Those poisons had already taken root. The doctors might be able to tell him how damaged her body was. What he feared most now was learning how deeply her mind had been taught to obey the woman he had trusted most. And by the time the hospital told him the full truth, Hollis Mercer would have one more reason to burn every bridge back to the life he had built with Blythe. The hospital did not give Hollis Mercer comfort. It gave him clarity, and clarity hurt far more than fear ever had. Under the harsh lights and clinical precision of the emergency room, every illusion he had lived with collapsed completely. There were no soft explanations left, no comforting theories, no carefully phrased reassurances. What remained was the undeniable truth written across his daughter's body. Aloan lay small and fragile on the hospital bed, wrapped in white sheets that seemed too large for her. Machines monitored what her body was struggling to maintain on its own. Her skin carried a pale, almost translucent tone that no longer resembled delicacy but depletion. The quiet rise and fall of her chest looked effortful, as if even breathing required more strength than she had left. For the first time, Hollis was not seeing his daughter through the filter of trust or routine. He was seeing her exactly as she was, a child pushed far beyond her limits, left with barely enough strength to function. The doctors worked efficiently, but their focus carried an unmistakable gravity. They did not behave like professionals dealing with a minor case. Their movements, their tone, even the silence between their words revealed that something serious had already been confirmed. Hollis stood nearby, unable to intervene, forced into the role of observer in a situation where he should have been protector from the beginning. As the test results came in, the picture sharpened. There was no rare illness, no hidden disease, no fragile condition that required extreme care. Eloan's body had simply been deprived. Her system lacked essential nutrients. Her iron levels had dropped. Her calcium was insufficient. Her electrolytes were dangerously unbalanced. These were not mysterious findings. They were predictable consequences. Any trained eye could trace them back to prolonged restriction, improper intake, and excessive physical strain. Everything Blythe had framed as health had been part of a slow deterioration. Hollis listened, but each explanation felt less like information and more like a sentence being read aloud. Every word stripped away the last remnants of denial. The weakness he had seen every morning was not natural. The fatigue was not coincidence. The constant discomfort was not a condition. It was damage. Damage that had been happening in front of him while he accepted it as something else. The deeper blow came when the psychological assessment began to take shape. Eloan was not just physically weakened. Her mind had been reshaped. Inside her, a new system had replaced instinct. Hunger no longer meant she should eat. It meant she should endure. Fatigue no longer meant she should rest. It meant she should try harder. Mistakes were no longer part of learning. They were failures that risked losing love. These beliefs did not come from a child's imagination. They had been taught, reinforced, repeated until they felt like truth. That realization hit harder than any medical report. Physical damage could be treated, monitored, repaired over time. But what Blythe had built inside Eloan could not be removed with medicine. It lived in her reactions, her fears, her silence. It would follow her into every meal, every movement, every moment of hesitation. It would whisper to her that she was not enough, that she had to earn safety, that comfort was dangerous. Hollis stepped back from the hospital bed and looked at his daughter through the glass panel once more. A nurse gently offered her a small snack, something simple, something normal. Eloan did not reach for it. She recoiled. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with quiet certainty. Her body pulled away as if she had learned to associate food not with relief but with risk. That small gesture carried more weight than any diagnosis. It showed that Blythe's control had reached into the most basic part of being human. Eating. And even that had been turned into fear. Hollis felt something shift inside him then. Until that moment, his emotions had been tangled. Shock, guilt, anger, confusion. But now they began to align into something sharper. Something colder. He was no longer reacting. He was deciding. This would not be handled quietly. This would not be negotiated. This would not be explained away. What had happened to Eloan was not a misunderstanding or a difference in parenting styles. It was harm, deliberate and sustained. And it would end completely. He turned to Miss Darlene, who had not left Eloan's side since they arrived. Her presence had become a quiet anchor in the chaos, a steady contrast to everything Blythe had imposed. Hollis gave clear instructions without hesitation. Eloan was not to be left alone. No one was to approach her without permission. Especially not Blythe. There would be no second chances, no opportunities for manipulation, no access disguised as concern. Then he left the hospital. The night outside felt colder than before, but it was clean in a way the house had not been. As the car moved through the wet streets, Hollis did not look out the window. His focus had turned inward, replaying every detail, but now those memories no longer paralyzed him. They fueled him. By the time he reached the mansion, he was no longer the man who had left it that morning. The house stood exactly as it had before, grand, silent, composed. But now it looked different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. What once seemed like a symbol of success now felt like a carefully constructed shell hiding something rotten beneath its surface. He entered without hesitation. The silence inside was no longer unsettling. It was confirming. It told him everything he needed to know about what had been happening when he was not there. No laughter. No warmth. No life. Just order without humanity. He moved directly upstairs. The family room still held the remnants of what he had seen earlier. The stool. The book. The empty space where Eloan had stood trembling. The room no longer looked like a place for a child. It looked like a controlled environment, stripped of spontaneity, designed for one purpose only: compliance. Hollis began searching. Drawers opened. Cabinets shifted. Objects were moved aside. He was not acting out of panic now. He was looking for confirmation, for something tangible that could expose the full extent of what had been hidden. And he found it. A black notebook. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. But as soon as he opened it, the reality inside became undeniable. Every page was filled with structured entries. Measurements. Timings. Intake. Performance. Notes written with precision and intent. This was not casual record-keeping. It was documentation of control. Eloan's life reduced to numbers and evaluations. Progress tracked not in happiness or health, but in endurance and reduction. Punishments disguised as adjustments. Restrictions disguised as discipline. There was no emotion in the writing. Only assessment. As if the child described in those pages was not a person, but a project. Hollis turned page after page, each one reinforcing the same pattern. There was no room left for doubt. This had been planned, maintained, perfected over time. Then something slipped from between the pages. A photograph. He picked it up. The image showed a young girl on a stage, dressed in formal clothing far too mature for her age. Her face was streaked with tears, her expression caught between fear and forced composure. Behind her stood an adult figure, rigid and disapproving, watching not with comfort, but with expectation. Hollis recognized the child immediately. Blythe. In that moment, the final piece fell into place. This was not random cruelty. It was repetition. Blythe had not simply created this system. She had inherited it. She had lived it. And instead of rejecting it, she had rebuilt it, refined it, and placed Eloan inside it. What had once been done to her, she now believed was necessary, justified, even beneficial. Understanding that did not soften anything. It only made the danger clearer. Because someone who believes they are saving a child can justify anything. Hollis closed the notebook slowly. There was nothing left to question. No uncertainty. No confusion. Only action. He gathered the notebook, the photograph, and everything else that mattered. Each item became evidence, not just of what had happened, but of how deeply it had been embedded into the structure of his home. As he turned toward the door, he sensed movement behind him. Blythe stood there, composed, but no longer untouchable. For the first time, the control she relied on was gone. Not because she had changed, but because Hollis had. The system she had built depended on his absence, his trust, his willingness to accept her authority. Without that, it had nothing to stand on. Hollis did not argue. He did not hesitate. He walked past her, down the stairs, into the living room, and placed the final decision on the table. A document that ended everything. Then he left. Behind him, the house remained silent, but no longer powerful. It had lost its hold the moment the truth was seen. Ahead of him was something far more difficult. Not just protecting Eloan, but helping her unlearn everything she had been taught to fear. And that would be the hardest part of all. When Hollis Mercer returned to the hospital, he was no longer carrying shock. He was carrying direction. The storm outside had weakened, but inside him something had hardened into clarity. The man who had walked in earlier as a confused father now moved with the focus of someone who understood that recovery would not happen by accident. It would have to be built, step by step, against everything that had already been planted inside his daughter. Eloan was awake when he entered the room. She did not rush toward him. She did not reach out. She did not smile. She watched him. That quiet, careful observation said more than any cry could have. Children who feel safe move toward comfort without hesitation. Eloan measured it. She studied him the way someone studies a situation that might change without warning. Her small body remained still under the blanket, her hands resting close to her chest, as if even movement required permission. Hollis approached slowly and sat beside her bed. He did not try to fix anything in that moment. He understood instinctively now that repair could not begin with force, even the force of love. What had been done to Eloan had taught her that every action came with consequence. Even kindness had been conditional. Even attention had been tied to performance. If he rushed her, if he overwhelmed her with sudden affection, it would not feel safe. It would feel like another expectation she might fail. So he stayed still. And for the first time since this began, he allowed silence to exist without filling it. Miss Darlene remained nearby, her presence grounding the room. She moved with quiet care, adjusting the blanket, making sure Eloan was warm, offering small reassurances through touch rather than words. She understood something Hollis was only beginning to learn. Healing would not come from explanations. It would come from consistency. The doctors continued their work, stabilizing Eloan's body. Nutrients were introduced carefully. Fluids restored balance. Her system, though weakened, responded. Children are resilient in ways that often defy logic, but resilience is not immunity. It does not erase what has been done. It only provides a chance to rebuild. The psychological damage, however, revealed itself more slowly. Each small interaction exposed another layer. When a nurse adjusted the bed, Eloan stiffened. When food was brought in, she hesitated. When attention was directed at her, she watched for signs of approval or disapproval. Every movement carried awareness. Every decision carried caution. It was not the behavior of a child. It was the behavior of someone trained to monitor themselves constantly. Hollis began to see just how deep the conditioning ran. The next morning, he brought something simple into the room. Not a grand gift. Not a distraction. Just a small item that belonged to normal life. A chocolate bar. It was not chosen for its value, but for its meaning. Something ordinary. Something children enjoyed without thinking. Something that did not require discipline or approval. Something that existed purely for pleasure. He placed it gently within Eloan's view. She noticed it immediately. But instead of curiosity, there was tension. Her eyes fixed on it, then shifted to him, then back again. Her fingers tightened slightly against the blanket. Her body leaned back just enough to create distance. It was a subtle movement, but unmistakable. Fear. Not of the object itself, but of what it represented. Hollis understood then that this was not about food. It was about permission. Eloan had been taught that eating freely was wrong. That enjoyment carried consequences. That sweetness was something to be avoided, controlled, denied. In her world, this was not a treat. It was a test. And she did not want to fail. Hollis did not urge her. He did not encourage. He did not explain. Instead, he did something unexpected. He took the chocolate himself. And he ate it. Not carefully. Not neatly. Without structure. Without control. He let it be imperfect. The action was simple, but its meaning was profound. For Eloane, this broke a rule she had believed was absolute. An adult, the most important adult in her life, was doing something she had been taught was wrong. And nothing bad happened. No punishment. No correction. No disappointment. Just a quiet moment where the world did not collapse. Eloane watched closely. Her eyes did not leave him. This was new. Unfamiliar. Confusing. For the first time, a crack appeared in the rigid system Blythe had built inside her. Not enough to change everything, but enough to begin. Later that day, Hollis brought something else. Not food. Not structure. A crayon. And a blank piece of paper. He placed them near her, not directly in her hands. He did not instruct her. He did not guide her. He simply made the possibility available. At first, Eloane did nothing. She looked at the paper. Then at the crayon. Then away. Time passed. Minutes stretched. But eventually, slowly, cautiously, her hand moved. She picked up the crayon. Her grip was tight at first, controlled, as if even drawing required precision. The first lines she made were small, hesitant, almost invisible. She did not fill the page. She did not explore. She stayed within a limited space, repeating short strokes, as if unsure how far she was allowed to go. Hollis watched without interrupting. That drawing mattered more than anything else in that room. Because it was not about the image. It was about choice. And for the first time in a long time, Eloane was making one. Over the next few days, small changes appeared. Not dramatic. Not immediate. But real. She began to eat slightly more. Still cautiously. Still slowly. But without the same immediate rejection. She began to look up more often. Her eyes, though still guarded, started to hold less fear. She responded to Miss Darlene's presence with less tension. She watched Hollis without shrinking. These were not signs of full recovery. They were signs of movement. And movement meant possibility. Hollis stayed with her through everything. He did not leave. He did not return to his old routines. For the first time, he chose presence over obligation. And that choice changed the rhythm of everything. He began to understand that rebuilding trust was not about saying the right things. It was about being there long enough for fear to lose its certainty. It was about showing, again and again, that nothing bad would follow simple acts of being a child. Eating. Drawing. Resting. Looking up. Each of these had to be relearned. Each of these had to become safe again. Outside the hospital, the rest of Hollis's life continued to shift. Legal processes began. Security arrangements were made. The house he had once considered home was already becoming something distant, something he no longer recognized as part of his future. Blythe, with all her control and certainty, was no longer part of the equation. But her influence still was. It lived in Eloane. And that meant the battle was not over. It had only changed form. Because removing the source of harm was only the beginning. Now Hollis had to do something far more difficult. He had to replace what had been taken. Not with force. Not with correction. But with something Blythe had never allowed. Freedom. And as he sat beside Eloane's bed, watching her slowly fill a blank page with uneven lines, Hollis realized that every small, uncertain mark she made was more than a drawing. It was the first step out of the cage she had been taught to live in. And he would have to walk that path with her, no matter how long it took. The hospital was never meant to be a permanent place, only a turning point. When Eloane was finally stable enough to leave, the doctors did not speak of recovery as something complete. They spoke of it as something fragile, something that would require time, patience, and consistency. Her body had begun to respond, but her mind still carried the imprint of everything she had been taught. Hollis understood that stepping out of the hospital did not mean stepping back into normal life. It meant entering a new one that had to be built carefully from the ground up. He did not take her back to the house. That decision had already been made long before discharge papers were signed. The mansion, with all its quiet rooms and controlled routines, was no longer a place of safety. It held too many invisible echoes, too many reminders of what had happened within its walls. Returning there would not heal Eloan. It would reinforce everything she was trying to escape. Instead, Hollis brought her somewhere smaller. A temporary home, simple and quiet, without excess, without structure that felt imposed. The rooms were warm in a way the mansion had never been. Light entered naturally. There were no hidden corners of control, no objects that carried meaning beyond their function. It was not impressive, but it was honest. And that honesty mattered more than anything else. The first days were the hardest. Without the hospital staff, without constant monitoring, the responsibility rested entirely on Hollis and Miss Darlene. Every meal became a careful moment. Every reaction mattered. Eloan still hesitated before eating, still watched for signs that she was doing something wrong. Even in a safe space, the old rules lingered, waiting to reassert themselves. Hollis did not rush her. He kept everything simple. Food was placed, not forced. Choices were offered, not demanded. Silence was allowed, not corrected. Each day followed a rhythm that did not pressure her to perform. There were no expectations of immediate change, no attempts to erase the past in a single gesture. Healing did not move forward in leaps. It moved in increments so small they were almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. And slowly, those increments appeared. Eloan began to eat without looking up for approval every time. She began to sit without holding her body in rigid control. She began to move without anticipating correction. These were not dramatic changes, but they were real. Each one marked a step away from the system that had defined her behavior. The turning point came quietly. It did not happen during a major event or a carefully planned moment. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, when Hollis opened the back door and let fresh air into the house. Outside, the world moved without structure. Wind carried sound. Leaves shifted freely. The space beyond the door had no rules attached to it. Eloan stood at the threshold. She did not step out immediately. She looked. She waited. The outside world was unfamiliar now, not because it had changed, but because her understanding of it had. Inside Blythe's system, movement had purpose. Action had evaluation. Even play had been restricted. Now, in front of her, was something without instruction. Hollis did not guide her. He did not encourage. He simply remained present. After a long moment, Eloan took a step forward. Then another. The grass beneath her feet shifted slightly, uneven and natural. It did not demand balance. It did not require precision. It did not measure her. That alone seemed to confuse her. She stood there, feeling something she had not felt in a long time. Unstructured freedom. At first, her movements were small. Careful. She walked in short steps, as if expecting correction that never came. Her body remained slightly tense, her awareness still scanning for reaction. But nothing followed. No voice. No instruction. No adjustment. Just space. Then something changed. It was subtle. A shift in posture. A release in her shoulders. A moment where her body stopped anticipating. And then, without planning it, she moved faster. Not controlled. Not measured. Just movement. Her steps became uneven, unbalanced in a way that would have once been corrected. But now, there was no correction. Only continuation. The air moved through her hair. The ground responded under her feet. The world did not collapse because she moved freely. And for the first time in a long time, something unfamiliar appeared on her face. Not caution. Not fear. Something lighter. Something unstructured. It did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, as if her mind needed to confirm that it was allowed. But once it appeared, it did not disappear immediately. Hollis watched from the doorway. He did not interrupt. He did not approach. He understood that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to her. Everything he had done up to this point had been preparation for this. Not control. Not correction. Just the removal of what had been placed on her. And now, without those constraints, something natural was returning. It was not complete. It was not permanent. But it was real. Miss Darlene stood beside him, silent, understanding the weight of what they were witnessing. This was not just a child stepping outside. It was a child beginning to exist without fear attached to every action. The legal process continued in the background. The separation from Blythe became final, not just in documents but in reality. There was no return, no reconsideration. The life Hollis had built before had been dismantled completely. What remained was something smaller, quieter, but infinitely more real. Blythe no longer had access. Her system no longer had reinforcement. But its traces would take time to disappear. That was the part Hollis accepted fully. There would be days when Eloan hesitated again. Days when fear returned. Days when progress seemed to stall. But those days would not define the outcome. Because now, she was no longer alone inside that system. Now, there was something stronger around her. Consistency. Safety. Presence. And most importantly, choice. As the afternoon light softened and the air cooled, Eloan slowed her steps and stood still again. She looked back toward the open door where Hollis stood. For a brief moment, there was no fear in that look. No calculation. Just awareness. It was not complete trust. But it was the beginning of it. Hollis met her gaze and remained exactly where he was. Not pulling. Not pushing. Allowing. Because he had finally learned what he should have known from the start. Love was not something a child had to earn. It was something they should never have to question. And as Eloan turned back toward the open space and took another step forward, the story did not end with resolution. It continued with something more important. A future no longer controlled by fear.